November 14th, 1945, Camp Cumberland, Pennsylvania. The mud at the roll call ground was freezing, a slurry of Pennsylvania clay and half-melted sleet that seeped into everything. Alara stood rigidly at attention, her breath pluming in the gray morning air. She tried to make herself weightless, shifting the pressure off her blistered heels. Beside her, Greta swayed, feverish, but Alara nudged her ribs sharply, a silent command to stay upright. To fall was to show weakness. To show weakness to the victors was dangerous. But the real danger wasn't the cold. It was the sound. Clack, clack. The distinct hollow noise of cracked wooden soles against wet gravel. It was the sound of defeat, of a nation that could no longer shoe its own people. Alara tucked her left foot behind her right ankle, trying to hide the split wood held together by rusty wire. She stared straight ahead, avoiding the eyes of the American logistics officer moving down the line. He didn't carry a truncheon. He didn't carry a rifle. He carried a yellow measuring tape. He stopped in front of Alara. The smell of his uniform, clean wool, tobacco, and something terrifyingly soap-like, assaulted her senses. He looked down at her feet, then up at her face. He didn't shout. He simply knelt. "It's all right," the officer murmured, his voice low, almost apologetic. He pulled the yellow tape taut. "Lift your foot, please, ma'am. Let's get you out of that wood. If you believe dignity can be found in the strangest of places, please subscribe and let us know which country you are watching from." 6 weeks earlier, the port of New York. The Liberty ship groaned against the pier, a deep, metallic complaint that vibrated through the steel hull. Down in the hold, the air was thick with the smell of 400 unwashed bodies, diesel fumes, and the lingering sourness of seasickness. Alara Weber sat on her canvas kit bag, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle. "Rouse! Everybody up! Move!" The command echoed from the hatch above, shouted in a flat, functional German by an American MP. Alara stood, smoothing the wrinkles of her gray auxiliary uniform. It was filthy, stained with salt and coal dust, but she buttoned the collar tight. Beside her, Greta shivered, her face pale and slick with sweat. "Stay close to me," Alara whispered, her voice raspy. "Do not look at them. Do not give them the satisfaction." They began the slow shuffle toward the ladder. As they climbed out of the dim, suffocating hold and into the blinding October afternoon of New York, the sensory overload was immediate. It wasn't the devastation of Hamburg or the ruins of Berlin. It was a landscape of terrifying wholeness. Cranes swung massive crates effortlessly. Trucks idled with the rumble of plentiful fuel, and the skyline in the distance stood arrogant and untouched. But as Alara stepped onto the gangway, the reality of her own condition shattered her composure. Clack! Her right foot struck the metal ramp. The sound was sharp, hollow, and undeniably impoverished. She took another step. Clack! It started as a trickle, then became a deluge of noise. 400 women, stripped of leather boots years ago by the failing Reich economy, were marching into the land of the victors wearing wood. Some wore Dutch-style sabots. Others, like Alara, wore crude wooden soles wired to canvas uppers. The sound was a chaotic percussion of defeat that drowned out the seagulls overhead. They reached the bottom of the gangway. A corridor of chain-link fencing separated them from the dock workers and a handful of curious civilians. Alara kept her eyes fixed on the back of the woman in front of her, terrified of seeing the hatred she knew must be there. The propaganda broadcasts had been clear. Americans were gangsters, lawless and cruel. "Keep moving! Line up by the trucks!" Alara hurried, but the pace was too fast for her footwear. The wire binding her left sole had rusted through weeks ago in the damp French holding camp. As she stepped onto the oil-slicked concrete of the pier, the wood caught on a rough patch. The wire snapped. Her ankle rolled violently. The wooden sole skittered away, leaving her stockinged foot exposed to the cold, wet ground. She pitched forward, gasping, bracing herself for the impact of a baton or the boot of a guard. In her mind, she was already flinching. But the blow never came. Instead, a hand clamped onto her upper arm. It was a firm, stabilizing grip. Alara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked up slowly, expecting a sneer. The American corporal holding her was young, with a face that looked like it had been scrubbed with sandpaper and soap. He wasn't looking at her with rage. He was looking at her foot. "Careful, Fräulein," he said. The words were not mocked. They were indifferent, bordering on bored. He hoisted her back to a standing position and pointed to the wooden block lying in the puddle. "Pick it up. You'll need it." Alara scrambled to retrieve the broken shoe, her face burning with a humiliation deeper than any physical pain. He hadn't hit her because she wasn't a threat. She was barely even a person to him. She was cargo. "Next station, delousing," a sergeant bellowed through a megaphone. The column was herded toward a series of tents. Inside, the efficiency of the American machine took over. There were no screams, only the hiss of pressurized sprayers. Alara was told to stand still, arms raised, eyes closed. She felt the cold blast of powder hit her scalp, her collar, down her sleeves. DDT. The cloud of white dust settled over them, coating their gray uniforms like a grotesque parody of snow. She coughed, tasting the chemical bitterness. "All right, you're processed," a medic said, marking a clipboard without making eye contact. "Move to the transport." Alara limped out of the tent, clutching her broken shoe against her chest to keep it from falling apart again. She looked at the other women, all dusted in white, powder, shivering not from cold, but from the shock of being handled so clinically. There was no glory here and no martyrdom. There was only the overwhelming industrial power of an enemy that could conquer them and clean them in the same breath. She climbed into the back of the waiting canvas truck, the wooden sole in her hand feeling light and useless. As the engine roared to life, drowning out the clack-clack of the others boarding behind her, Alara realized the war was truly over, and she had lost it in a pair of broken shoes. The mess hall at Camp Cumberland was a cathedral of noise and steam. After the long, freezing truck ride from the rail yard, the sudden warmth of the building hit Alara like a physical blow. It smelled of wet wool, pine disinfectant, and something else. Something so rich and forgotten that it made her salivary glands ache painfully. It was the smell of animal fat. "Single file, grab a tray." The command came from a bored-looking corporal leaning against a pillar. Alara shuffled forward, her broken shoe dragging slightly. She picked up a metal tray. It was stamped aluminum, divided into compartments, clean and free of rust. In the camps in France, they had eaten out of tin cans or helmets. She moved down the line, her eyes widening despite her resolve. The servers were American soldiers, sleeves rolled up, ladling food with a casual abundance that bordered on obscene. First came a scoop of yellow mound, powdered eggs, rehydrated and steaming. Then a ladle of beans in a thick molasses sauce. But what made Alara's breath hitch was the bread. 2 thick slices were dropped onto her tray. It wasn't the dark sawdust-filled Kommissbrot they had rationed in ounces for the last 2 years. It was white bread, pure, refined, spongy white bread. "Move it along," the server grunted, dropping a square of yellow butter on top of the bread. Alara stared at the butter. It was a perfect cube. Real fats had vanished from her life in 1943. She looked up at the soldier, waiting for the catch, waiting for him to demand a bribe, or for the food to be snatched away as a psychological torture trick. But he was already looking at the next woman in line. They were herded to long wooden tables. Alara sat across from Greta. The noise of 400 women sitting down was deafening, but as soon as the eating began, a strange, frantic silence fell over the hall. The only sounds were the scraping of forks against metal and the wet, desperate noises of chewing. Alara looked at her food. The portion was enormous. It had to be over 1,000 calories on a single tray. She remembered the lectures from the party officers. The Americans are soft, but they are cruel. They will starve you to break your spirit. Is it poisoned? Greta whispered, staring at the eggs. Her hands were shaking, her face flushed with fever. Look at the guards, Alara murmured, nodding toward the end of the room. The American MPs were sitting at their own table, eating the exact same food. They slouched, drinking coffee from thick mugs, laughing at a joke. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were entitled to the same quality of rations as the base troops. Alara knew the law on paper, but seeing it practiced was a shock to her system. She cut a piece of the white bread, spread the butter, and put it in her mouth. The taste was overwhelming. It was soft, almost sweet, and the grease coated her tongue in a way that felt sinful. Her stomach clenched, confused by the sudden influx of richness. Across the table, Greta pushed her tray away. "I can't," she wheezed. "My throat." Alara glanced around. The guards were distracted, but the logistics sergeant, the one who had watched them at the truck, was walking down the aisle. He moved slowly, his eyes scanning the tables. "You must eat," Alara hissed. "You need the strength." Greta shook her head, her eyes closing. She was fading. Alara made a split-second decision. She reached across the table, took the square of butter from Greta's tray, and slid it onto her own slice of bread. Then, she broke the bread in half and forced it into Greta's hand. "Eat the bread with the double butter," Alara commanded softly. "It goes down easier." A shadow fell over the table. Alara froze. She looked up to see the sergeant standing right beside them. He was looking at the double portion of butter in Greta's hand. In the German army, stealing rations or swapping food could result in severe punishment. Alara braced herself. She prepared to stand up, to take the blame, to shield Greta. The sergeant looked at Alara. His expression was unreadable. He looked at the pale, sweating face of Greta, then back at the butter. He reached into his pocket. For a terrifying second, Alara thought he was pulling out a citation book. Instead, he pulled out a pack of cigarettes, tapped one out, and lit it. "Drink the water too," he said, his voice flat. "Dehydration kills faster than hunger." He turned and walked away, leaving a trail of tobacco smoke. Alara sat back, her heart pounding against her ribs. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't confiscated the food. He had offered advice. She looked down at her tray, at the remaining yellow eggs. She ate them, not with joy, but with a grim determination. They were fattening them up, yes, but for what purpose? The kindness was a weapon she didn't know how to parry. The whistle blew at 0530, a sharp, shrill sound that cut through the damp morning fog of Pennsylvania. Inside the barracks, the reaction was instant. There was no groaning, no slow waking. Decades of discipline kicked in. 400 women swung their legs out of their bunks in unison, their movements efficient and practiced. But as soon as their feet hit the floor, the discipline was betrayed by their equipment. Clack, thud, scrape. Alara pulled on her gray wool stockings, darned at the heel with unraveled thread from a blanket. She reached for her shoes. The wooden sole she had broken at the pier was now held together by a fresh piece of wire she had scavenged from a crate, but the structural integrity was gone. It sat on the floor like a dead thing, a block of poplar wood, stained with mud, crowned with stiff, cracking canvas. "Schnell, ladies, schnell," the barrack leader whispered. Ilara shoved her foot into the unforgiving wood. She winced as the wire dug into her instep. She stood up, trying to distribute her weight. The trick she had learned was to shuffle, to slide the wood along the floor rather than step. It saved energy, and more importantly, it was quieter. They filed out into the assembly yard. The sun hadn't risen yet. The floodlights bathed the camp in a harsh, artificial glare that turned the frost on the ground into glittering diamonds. "Fall in, by fives." The command came from a lieutenant standing on a raised wooden platform. He looked warm in his fleece-lined bomber jacket, a stark contrast to the thin tunics of the prisoners. The women marched to their positions. And there it was again, the sound. Clack, clack, clack. On the frozen earth it was dull, but on the concrete pad of the roll call area, it was deafening. It sounded like a cascade of falling dominoes. It was the sound of a disorganized rabble, not a military unit. Ilara stood in the third row. She tried to stand perfectly still, but the cold seeped up through the wood instantly. Her toes were numb. Around her, she could hear the slight shifting of weight as other women tried to keep their blood flowing. Every shift produced a hollow knock of wood on stone. The lieutenant frowned. He stopped reading the clipboard and looked up. He didn't yell. He just waited. The silence that followed was agonizing. The women froze. Ilara held her breath, her chest tight. In the camps in Europe, a pause like this meant someone was about to be pulled out of line. It meant a search. It meant a beating. The lieutenant stepped down from the platform. He walked toward the formation, the soft thud of his leather combat boots barely audible. He moved with a predator's grace, silent, assured, comfortable. He stopped at the front of Ilara's column. He looked at the woman in front of her, then down at her feet. Then he stepped to the side and looked at Ilara. He pointed a gloved finger at her left foot. "Lift it," he said. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She balanced on her right leg, lifting the broken clog. The wire glittered under the floodlights. The wood was split nearly in half, flexing ominously as she suspended it in the air. It looked ridiculous. It looked like something a peasant in a fairy tale would wear, not a soldier of the Reich. She felt the heat of shame rise up her neck. She wanted him to scream at her. She wanted him to call her a kraut. That she could handle. Hatred was familiar. But the lieutenant didn't hate her. He looked at the shoe with a mixture of curiosity and professional annoyance. He took a small notebook from his pocket and uncapped a pen. 80% failure rate on footwear, he muttered to himself, writing something down. Labor efficiency compromised. He looked up at Ilara. Put it down. She lowered her foot. Clack. "Does it hurt?" he asked. The question was sudden, stripped of any inflection. I am fine, sir," Ilara stammered, her English stiff. "I didn't ask if you were fine," the lieutenant said, closing his notebook. "I asked if it hurts." Ilara hesitated. To admit pain was to admit weakness, but lying to an officer was a violation of regulations. "Yes, sir, it cuts the skin." The lieutenant nodded, as if she had just confirmed a weather report. "Right. Dismissed for work detail." He turned his back and walked away. Ilara stood there, trembling slightly as the formation broke up to head toward the trucks that would take them to the apple orchards. She looked down at her feet. They hadn't confiscated the shoes. They hadn't punished her for the noise. They had simply cataloged her pain. As she began the slow walk to the transport, the clack-clack of her broken shoe seemed louder than ever. It was no longer just the sound of poverty. It was a distress signal she hadn't meant to send, and she had no idea how the Americans planned to answer it. Sunday arrived not with a bang, but with a heavy, suspended silence. In the German army, Sunday had been a day of polished boots and speeches about victory. Here, in the Pennsylvania hinterlands, It was simply a day where the machinery of the camp slowed down. The afternoon light filtered through the dust-coated windows of Barrack 4, casting long, lazy rectangles of gold onto the wooden floorboards. Alara sat on the edge of her bunk, watching the dust motes dance. Around her, the women were quiet. Some were mending their uniforms. Others were writing letters that might never be delivered. "It is time," Greta whispered. She was looking better today, the double rations of bread and butter having put a little color back into her cheeks. Alara nodded. She stood up and walked to the center of the room, where a small space had been cleared between the rows of bunks. Slowly, other women joined them. 10, then 20, then 50. They formed a tight circle, standing shoulder to shoulder. They had no altar. They had no cross. Worst of all, they had no Bible. The Americans hadn't confiscated them. They just hadn't had any German-language Bibles to give. "We will do it from memory," Alara announced softly. Psalm 23. She closed her eyes, clasping her hands in front of her waist. "Der Herr ist mein Hirte, mir wird nichts mangeln." "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." Her voice was thin, wavering slightly in the stale air. The others joined in, a low murmur of voices trying to conjure the sanctity of a stone cathedral inside a wooden shed. They spoke the words like a spell against the reality of their imprisonment. As they reached the line, "Und ob ich schon wanderte im finstern Tal?" "Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." The heavy door of the barrack creaked open. The chanting died instantly. The silence that rushed back into the room was brittle with fear. Alara opened her eyes. Standing in the doorway was a private first class, a young guard with red hair and a face full of freckles. He held his rifle loosely in one hand. In the other, he dragged something heavy. The women stepped back, shrinking against the bunks. Gatherings of this size could be interpreted as plotting an escape or a riot. Alara stepped forward, shielding Greta. She prepared her apology, the English words clumsy on her tongue. "We are just praying," Alara said, her chin lifted. "It is Sunday." The private looked at them. He looked at the fearful faces, the clasped hands. He didn't raise his rifle. Instead, he hefted the object in his left hand and set it down on a nearby footlocker with a heavy thud. It was a black case, battered and scuffed. The private unlatched it. "Chaplain sent this over," the soldier mumbled, avoiding eye contact. "Said you folks might want some music. Just keep the volume down, all right? No political songs." He turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Alara stared at the open case. Nestled inside, resting on red velvet that smelled of mildew and old attic memories, was an accordion. It was a Hohner, German-made, likely brought over by an immigrant family decades ago or captured as a souvenir. Greta gasped. She moved forward, her hands trembling as she touched the mother-of-pearl keys. "I played," she whispered, "in school, before the war." "Play," Alara said. Her throat felt tight. Greta lifted the instrument. It wheezed as she expanded the bellows, a sound like a deep, heavy breath. She tested a chord. It was out of tune, sharp and jarring, but to Alara, it sounded like a miracle. Greta began to play. The melody was simple, mournful, and instantly recognizable. "Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott." A mighty fortress is our God. The women began to sing. At first they were hesitant, glancing at the windows, expecting the door to burst open again. But no one came. The Americans were letting them sing. Alara sang, but her mind was racing. If they had beaten her, she would have hated them with a pure cleansing fire. If they had starved her, she would have felt superior in her suffering. But this? Giving them music? Allowing them to worship in their own language? It was a trap, she told herself. It had to be. They were trying to make the prisoners soft, to make them forget that they were enemies. But as the notes of the accordion swelled, filling the barrack with the sounds of home, Alara felt the armor around her heart develop a hairline fracture. She looked down at her wooden shoes, then up at the dusty rafters. For the first time since her capture, she didn't feel like a number on a list. She felt human. And that, she realized with a jolt of terror, was the most dangerous thing the Americans could have done to her. The apple orchard lay under a low, bruising sky. It was late November, and the harvest was essentially a salvage operation. The wind whipped through the bare branches, carrying the scent of wet earth and fermenting fruit that had fallen to rot in the grass. Alara stood on the third rung of a wooden ladder, her fingers numb inside her thin gloves. She reached for a withered winesap apple, twisting it from the branch with a mechanical efficiency. Below her, the ground was a churned mess of mud and slush. "Keep the pace," the foreman shouted from the edge of the row. He was a civilian, a local farmer who looked at the prisoners not as enemies, but as cheap, confusing labor. Alara descended the ladder. As her foot touched the ground, she felt the sickening squelch of mud swallowing her shoe. The wooden soles, which had been dry and brittle in the summer, were now waterlogged sponges. They had swelled, distorting their shape, pressing against the sides of her feet like a vice. Every step was a battle against suction. She grabbed the rim of her bushel basket, heaving it onto her shoulder. The weight was crushing, 40 pounds of fruit pressing down on a spine that hadn't seen a proper mattress in years. She gritted her teeth. "Move! Do not stop. You are German." She took a step toward the collection truck. The mud held fast. She pulled harder. Crack. The sound was muffled, but unmistakable. It wasn't the clean snap of a dry twig. It was the wet, tearing sound of fibrous wood giving up the ghost. The sole of her left shoe disintegrated. The heel sheared off completely, staying buried in the Pennsylvania clay, while the front half twisted violently. Alara's foot slipped from the remnants of the canvas upper. She pitched sideways, the basket slipping from her shoulder. Apples spilled everywhere, rolling into the muck like red stones. Alara hit the ground hard. Her hands sank into the freezing slush. But the cold was instantly forgotten, replaced by a white-hot lance of pain shooting up her leg. A jagged splinter from the shattered heel had driven itself deep into her soft, water-softened skin. "No!" she gasped, scrambling to her knees. She clawed at the mud, trying to find purchase, trying to stand before anyone saw. "Halt! Hold it right there!" The voice didn't belong to the farmer. It was American military baritone. Alara froze, mud dripping from her nose and chin. She looked up. Sergeant Miller was walking toward her from the jeep parked on the access road. He wasn't running. He moved with that infuriating, loose-limbed American stride. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the spilled apples. He looked at the mud covering her uniform. Finally, his eyes landed on her foot. Blood was already seeping through her wool stocking, dark and stark against the gray sludge. I can work," Alara stammered, trying to push herself up. "It is just a slip." She put weight on the foot and immediately collapsed with a sharp cry she couldn't suppress. The pain was blinding. Miller didn't yell. He didn't pull out his pistol. He crouched down, ignoring the mud that coated his polished boots. "You're done, Weber," he said quietly. "Please," Alara begged, panic rising. "Do not report me. I can finish the quota." In her mind, injury meant uselessness. Uselessness meant the gas chamber, or at best, starvation rations. Miller sighed. He reached out, brushing her hand away from her injury. He inspected the jagged wood protruding from her heel. "You're not a mule, and this isn't the Eastern Front," he muttered. Before Alara could protest, Miller stood up and leaned down. In one fluid motion, he scooped her up, one arm behind her back, the other under her knees. Alara went rigid. She was being held by the enemy. His uniform smelled of rain and tobacco. He was warm. The contact was shocking, violating every rule of engagement she had ever known. Prisoners were to be marched, herded, or dragged. They were not carried. "Relax," Miller said, feeling her stiffness. "I'm not going to drop you." He carried her past the staring eyes of the other women, who stood frozen on their ladders, apples in hand, and past the confused farmer. He walked straight to the jeep. He deposited her gently into the passenger seat. Alara pulled her legs in, ashamed of the blood dripping onto the floorboard. She looked at Miller as he walked around to the driver's side. He stopped for a moment to kick the mud off his boots. He climbed in and started the engine. He didn't look at her. He just shifted gears and steered the vehicle toward the camp gate. "We need to get you to the clinic," he said, his voice devoid of anger. "And we need to get you out of those damn boxes before you lose a foot." Alara slumped against the cold canvas seat. She watched the orchard blur past. The pain in her foot was throbbing, but the confusion in her mind was worse. She had failed. She had broken. And instead of a bullet, she had been given a ride. The clinic at Camp Cumberland was terrifyingly white. To Alara, who had spent the last 2 years in the gray mud of the front and the dark holds of ships, the brightness was an assault. The walls were painted a glossy, sterile cream. The floors were checkerboard linoleum that shone under the fluorescent lights. It smelled of iodine, floor wax, and the sharp metallic tang of absolute cleanliness. Sergeant Miller kicked the door open with his boot, carrying Alara into the reception area. He bypassed the clerk at the desk, marching straight into one of the examination bays. He set Alara down on the examination table. The paper covering crinkled loudly beneath her wet uniform. "Lieutenant," Miller called out, "got a workplace injury, puncture wound, foot." A curtain was pulled back, and a woman in a starched white uniform stepped in. She was older, with steel gray hair tucked under a cap and eyes that looked like they had seen everything but chose to remain kind. She didn't look at Alara's uniform or the POW, stenciled on her back. She looked straight at the bleeding foot. "Let's get that boot off," the nurse said, her voice brisk and professional. She reached for the shattered remains of the wooden clog. The wire was tangled in the wool stocking. With a pair of shears, she snipped the wire and peeled the wood away. Then she reached for the stocking. Alara flinched, pulling her leg back. "No," she croaked. I can do it." She didn't want them to see the skin beneath, the blisters, the calluses, the dirt that had been ground into her pores over months of marching. It was a map of her degradation. "Honey, you're shaking," the nurse said softly. "Let me help." She ignored Alara's protest and gently peeled the blood-soaked wool away. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the sting of judgment. But there was only the sound of water running into a metal basin. The nurse returned with a stainless steel bowl filled with steaming water and a bar of yellow soap. She placed the basin on a stool and submerged a white washcloth. "This is going to sting a little," the nurse warned. Alara watched as the woman wrung out the cloth. She waited for the harsh scrubbing, the rough handling she deserved as an enemy of the state. Instead, the nurse cupped Alara's heel with one hand and began to wash the foot. The motion was slow, deliberate, and incredibly gentle. The warm water dissolved the freezing mud of the orchard. The soap smelled of lavender, a scent so domestic, so normal, that it made Alara's head spin. The nurse washed away the blood. She washed away the orchard clay. She washed between the toes and over the high arch where the wooden sole had bruised the bone. Alara stared at the top of the nurse's head. In the German army, hygiene was a duty. Here, it felt like a benediction. The nurse wasn't treating a prisoner. She was treating a patient. The distinction broke something inside Alara. The rigid tension in her shoulders collapsed. "Clean," the nurse whispered. She dried the foot with a towel that was softer than Alara's blanket. Then she reached for a glass vial and a syringe. Panic flared instantly. The old propaganda screamed in Alara's mind. Truth serum, poison, sterilization. 9! Alara jerked back, her hand flying up defensively. "No needle! No medicine!" Miller, who had been leaning against the doorframe, stepped forward. "It's tetanus, Weber. Lockjaw. You stepped on dirty wood." "No," Alara insisted, her breathing shallow. "I do not want it." The nurse paused, holding the syringe. She looked at Miller, then back at Alara. She didn't force the needle. She didn't call for restraints. She simply set the syringe down on the metal tray with a soft clink. "All right," the nurse said calmly. "No shot, but I have to clean the wound with alcohol and stitch it. Can you handle that?" Alara looked at the syringe, then at the nurse's open, honest face. They were respecting her refusal. They were giving her a choice. "Yes," Alara whispered. "I can handle it." The alcohol burned like fire, but Alara didn't make a sound. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, focusing on the sergeant standing in the corner. He was holding the remains of her wooden shoe. He turned the broken heel over in his hands, examining the rusty wire and the splintered poplar. As the nurse finished the bandage, a thick, white dressing that felt like a cloud around her foot, Miller tossed the wooden pieces into the metal trash can in the corner. Clang. "You can't walk in those anymore," Miller said, his voice low. "And you can't work if you can't walk." He looked at Alara, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if solving a math problem in his head. "Stay here. Let the anesthetic cream work. I have to go check the surplus inventory." He turned and left. Alara sat on the crinkling paper, her clean, bandaged foot resting on the stool, listening to the silence of the clinic and wondering why the loss of her shoes felt less like a tragedy and more like a beginning. The ride back from the clinic was a blur of gray clouds and silence. When the jeep stopped at the barracks, Sergeant Miller didn't help Alara out this time. He simply waited for her to climb down, her bandaged foot protected by a thick wool sock he had requisitioned from the supply room. "Wait for the call," was all he said before driving off. Alara hobbled into the barrack, the white bandage glowing like a beacon in the dim interior. The conversation died instantly. 399 pairs of eyes turned to her. They looked at her foot, then at her face. They were searching for signs of trauma, for the telltale hollowness that came after an interrogation. "What did they do?" Greta asked, rushing forward to support Alara's elbow. "They washed it," Alara said, sitting heavily on her bunk. "And they took the shoe." A ripple of unease moved through the room. To a prisoner, the loss of equipment was the first step toward extinction. If they took the shoes, what was next? The coats? The blankets? "I heard the guards talking," a woman from the bunk above whispered. "They said inventory. They said surplus liquidation." The words hung in the air like smoke. Liquidation. In German, the word had terrible connotations, but even in the American context, it sounded final. The fear began to metastasize. The women started hiding their meager possessions: a comb with missing teeth, a photo of a husband, a spare button, tucking them under loose floorboards or sewing them into the lining of their tunics. Crackle, pop, whine. The loudspeaker mounted on the pole outside screeched to life, making everyone jump. "Achtung! Achtung!" The voice was metallic and distorted. "All prisoners will report to the main assembly hall immediately. Leave all personal effects in the barracks. Report in numerical order." "This is it," Greta said, her voice trembling. "They're going to strip us." Alara stood up. The pain in her heel was dull now, muffled by the clean bandage, but the dread in her stomach was sharp. "We go," she said, her voice steady. "We do not let them see us afraid." The march to the assembly hall was slow. The ground was freezing, and Ilara had to limp, her wool-socked foot numb against the cold earth. The sound of the others was still the same chaotic clack-clack of wooden soles, but now it felt like a countdown. They filed into the large hall. It was usually used for indoor recreation or movies, but today, the chairs had been pushed to the walls. The center of the room was empty. Ilara took her place in the line. The air in the hall was cold and smelled of floor wax and stale cigarette smoke. At the front of the room, a table had been set up. Behind it stood the camp commander and Sergeant Miller. They didn't look angry. They looked busy. The commander checked his watch. He nodded to Miller. Miller walked to the side door and kicked it open. "Bring 'em in," he shouted. Ilara braced herself. She expected MP guards with dogs. She expected a squad of soldiers to conduct body searches. She gripped Greta's hand, squeezing it tight. But no dogs came. Instead, a line of privates walked in, groaning under the weight of what they were carrying. They weren't carrying weapons. They were carrying boxes, big brown corrugated cardboard boxes. They were stamped with black stenciled letters, U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, surplus. The soldiers stacked the boxes against the wall, creating a wall of cardboard that reached nearly to the ceiling. There were dozens of them, hundreds. The sound of the heavy boxes hitting the floor, thud, 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 replaced the silence of the prisoners. Ilara stared at the boxes. They were sealed with brown tape. They didn't look like punishment. They looked like cargo. "Listen up," the commander barked. The room went deathly still. "We have a logistics problem. Your footwear is destroying my floors, slowing down my harvest, and causing medical waste. The United States Army does not tolerate inefficiency." He gestured to the wall of cardboard. "We have a surplus of 3 million pairs of service boots sitting in warehouses from here to Ohio since VE Day. We're not shipping them back to Europe. So, we're clearing the inventory." Miller stepped forward, holding a clipboard. He looked straight at Ilara, his eyes unreadable. "This is a sizing line," Miller announced. "Not an inspection. Step up, get measured, get issued. Move." The tension in the room didn't vanish. It mutated. It shifted from the fear of death to a bewildered confusion. They weren't being punished. They were being upgraded. Ilara looked at the cardboard wall, then down at her bandaged foot. The Americans were solving the problem of her pain, not with sympathy, but with boxes. The line moved with a sluggish, bureaucratic rhythm. One by one, the women stepped up to the long wooden table, sat on a folding chair, and extended their legs. Ilara stood at the very end of the queue, her weight leaning heavily on her good leg. From her vantage point, she watched the ritual unfold. It was a strange, industrial baptism. A prisoner would sit, an American soldier would crouch. There would be a brief exchange of numbers, a scribbling of pencils, and then the prisoner would move to the stack of boxes. "Next!" Ilara felt a cold sweat prickle under her collar. It wasn't the fear of pain anymore. It was the fear of exposure. For 3 years, her feet had been her primary mode of transport and her greatest source of misery. They were no longer the feet of the young girl who had danced in Munich beer halls. They were hardened, calloused, misshapen things with yellowed nails and scars from blisters that had burst and healed over and over again. To show them to a man, an enemy man, felt like a violation of her last private shame. The line dwindled. 10 women. 5, 2. Then it was just Ilara. She shuffled forward, the wool sock on her left foot sliding silently on the floorboards, while her right wooden shoe gave one last, solitary clack before she reached the chair. "Sit down, Weber," Sergeant Miller said. He didn't look up from his clipboard immediately. He was finishing the entry for the previous girl. his pen scratching loudly in the quiet hall. Alara sat. The metal chair was cold against her thighs. She clasped her hands in her lap, squeezing her fingers until the knuckles turned white. She stared at the wall of cardboard boxes, refusing to look down. Miller capped his pen and clipped it to his pocket. He stepped around the table. He didn't carry a weapon. He held a soft, yellow fabric measuring tape, coiled loosely in his large hand. He stopped in front of her. The smell of him was close now. Clean wool, tobacco smoke, and the faint, sharp scent of aftershave. It was the smell of a man who had access to hot water and mirrors. He looked down at her feet. The right one was still encased in the dirty, cracked wooden clog. The left was wrapped in the white medical bandage and the gray wool sock. He didn't grimace. He didn't make a joke about the smell or the dirt. He simply bent his knees and lowered himself to the floor. Alara's breath hitched. An American sergeant was kneeling at the feet of a German prisoner. In the hierarchy of war, this was inverted. The victor stood. The vanquished knelt. But Miller had flipped the world upside down to get the job done. "I need the right one first," Miller said, his voice low, almost apologetic, echoing the tone he had used in the orchard. "Let's get you out of that wood." He reached out and unbuckled the strap of her remaining clog. He pulled the heavy, mud-caked object away and set it aside. Then he took her heel in his hand. His palm was rough, warm, and steady. Alara flinched, her muscles locking up. "It is dirty," she whispered, the English words tasting like ash. "I am sorry." Miller paused. He looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. "Ma'am, I grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. I've seen dirty. This is just history." He uncoiled the yellow tape. He draped it over her instep, pulling it taut but not tight. He measured the length, then the width at the ball of her foot. He moved with the efficiency of a tailor, not a jailer. "You have high arches," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "That wood must have been hell." He moved to the bandaged foot. He didn't unwrap it. Instead, he measured over the dressing, his fingers light and careful, ensuring he didn't press on the wound he had helped clean hours earlier. He added a fraction of an inch to his mental calculation to account for the swelling. Alara looked down at the top of his head. She watched the yellow tape wrap around her foot, a bright golden line encircling her pain. It wasn't a chain. It wasn't a shackle. It was a tool of precision. For the first time in years, she wasn't being estimated or approximated. She was being measured. She mattered enough to be accurate. Miller stood up, his knees popping slightly. The spell broke, but the feeling remained. He wrote a number on a small paper tag. "Size 7 narrow," he announced to the private manning the boxes. Then he looked back at Alara and handed her the tag. "Go get your boots, Weber." Alara took the slip of paper. Her hand brushed his for a split second. "Thank you," she said. It was the first time she had said those words to an American without resentment. "Don't thank me," Miller grunted, turning back to his paperwork. "Just thank the taxpayer." The Barrack 4 smelled different that night. The lingering odors of unwashed bodies, damp wool, and stale cabbage had been overpowered by a new, aggressive scent. It was rich, earthy, and intoxicating. It was the smell of cured leather. Alara sat on the edge of her bunk, the cardboard box resting on her knees. The label on the side was stamped in blue ink: Boots, Service, Combat, Composition Sole, Size 7N. She hadn't opened it yet. Around her, the other women were already engaging in a frenzy of lacing and fitting. There were gasps of disbelief, whispered comparisons, and the soft thud of heels being stamped into new insoles. It sounded like a cobbler's shop, not a prison. "Open it, Alara," Greta urged from the next bunk. Greta was already wearing hers. She extended her leg, rotating her ankle. The brown leather shone dully in the dim light. "They are lined. They have arches." Alara ran her hand over the cardboard lid. A wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. "My mother is boiling wallpaper to get the glue for soup in Hamburg," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My sister writes that she has wrapped her feet in newspaper inside her shoes to keep out the frost. And I am sitting here in the enemy's camp holding brand new leather." It felt like treason. To accept the food was biological necessity. To accept the medicine was survival. But this felt like luxury. It felt like she was being bought. "If you don't wear them, they will rot in a warehouse," Greta said, her voice pragmatic. "The Americans have too much. They drown in things. Your mother would not want you to lose your feet to gangrene out of pride." Alara looked at the box. Greta was right, of course, but the guilt was a heavy cloak. She thought of the wooden clog she had left in the trash can at the clinic. That wood was German. It was honest in its poverty. This leather was a bribe. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in brown wax paper, lay the boots. They were beautiful in a utilitarian, heavy-handed way. High ankles, sturdy eyelets, thick rubber soles that promised traction on wet concrete. The leather was stiff, dyed a deep cordovan brown. Alara lifted one out. It was heavy. She loosened the laces, opening the tongue wide. She looked at her left foot, still wrapped in the white medical bandage. The nurse had told her it would fit. Miller had measured for it. She slid her foot in. There was no resistance, no pinch of wood against bone, no sharp bite of wire. The boot swallowed her foot, the leather upper hugging her ankle with a firm, supportive pressure. It felt like a handshake. She pulled the laces tight, crisscrossing them up the hooks, left over right, right over left. The ritual was familiar, a muscle memory from her days in the training corps, but the sensation was entirely new. She tied the knot. She stood up. She expected pain. She braced for the familiar wobble of the wooden sole, but when her weight settled into the boots, the rubber sole absorbed the shock. She stood flat, stable, and silent. She took a step. Silence. She took another. Silence. The clack-clack that had defined her existence for 2 years, the sound that announced her shame to the world before she even entered a room, was gone. In its place was the muffled, professional tread of a soldier. Alara walked to the window. She looked out at the camp yard, bathed in the harsh floodlights. The snow had started to fall again, swirling in the cones of light. Tomorrow, she would walk out there. She would walk through the mud and the ice. She looked down at the brown leather. The guilt was still there, a dull ache in her chest, but it was being crowded out by a newer, sharper realization. The Americans had not just given her shoes. They had given her back her stealth. They had given her back her ability to move through the world without announcing her brokenness. "I will wear them," Alara whispered to the cold glass pane. "I will wear them to work. I will survive this winter, and I will walk home in them." She turned back to the room. The smell of leather was no longer the scent of a bribe. It was the scent of the future. And for the first time, Alara decided she wanted to be part of it. The snow had fallen overnight, burying Camp Cumberland in a thick, pristine blanket of white. In previous years, this weather would have been a sentence of misery. It would have meant wet socks, frost-bitten toes, and the treacherous, sliding panic of wooden soles on ice. But this morning, Alara Weber stepped out of Barrack 4 and felt nothing. Or rather, she felt traction. The thick rubber soles of her issued combat boots bit into the packed snow with a satisfying crunch. There was no slip, no slide. The leather, now broken in after weeks of wear, held her ankles in a warm, firm embrace. She wiggled her toes inside the wool socks. They were dry. She walked toward the assembly area. The soundscape of the camp had been revolutionized. 6 weeks ago, the movement of 400 women sounded like a hailstorm hitting a tin roof, a cacophony of clack, clack, clack. Now it was a low, rhythmic thrum. The dull thud of leather on snow was the sound of an army, yes, but it was also the sound of order. It was the sound of people who were no longer struggling simply to stand upright. Formation. The call was routine now. Alara took her place. The anxiety that used to ripple through the ranks during inspections had evaporated. They weren't hiding cracked wood or bleeding heels anymore. They stood taller. The shame that had bent their spines had been replaced by a strange, quiet dignity. As the roll call ended, a truck rumbled through the main gate. It wasn't a supply truck. It was a transport, canvas flaps tied down against the wind. It ground to a halt near the administration building, and the tailgate dropped. A dozen women climbed out. They were new transfers from a holding camp in the Midwest. Their uniforms were ragged, their faces gray with exhaustion. And then the sound returned. Clack. Scrape. Clack. Alara flinched. The noise of the wooden shoes on the cleared pavement was jarring, like a discordant note in a symphony. The new women huddled together, looking at the veterans of Cumberland with wide, fearful eyes. They looked at the leather boots, then down at their own wooden blocks, trying to shuffle their feet to hide them in the snow. Alara saw a young girl at the edge of the new group. She couldn't have been more than 18. She was shivering violently, her left foot drawn up like a flamingo, trying to keep the weight off a split wooden sole. Alara felt the ghost of the pain in her own heel. She looked at the guard tower, then at the group. The old Alara would have looked away, preserving her own safety. The new Alara, grounded by American leather, stepped out of formation. She walked across the snowy no-man's land between the two groups. Her steps were silent. She stopped in front of the young girl. "Do not hide it," Alara said in German, her voice calm and authoritative. The girl looked up, terrified. I'm sorry. It is broken." "They know," Alara said. She pointed toward the supply building where Sergeant Miller was standing on the porch, smoking his morning cigarette. "When they ask you, do not lie. Do not say you are fine. Tell them your size." "My size?" the girl stammered. "Size 7, size 8. "Whatever it is," Alara said. She reached out and adjusted the girl's collar, a gesture of sisterhood that bridged the gap between the old misery and the new reality. "They will measure you. Let them. It is not a trap." The girl looked at Alara's boots, then back at her face. Slowly, the terror began to drain from her eyes, replaced by a fragile hope. "Thank you," she whispered. Alara turned to walk back to her work detail. As she passed the supply building, she slowed her pace. Sergeant Miller was watching. He had seen the exchange. He wasn't smiling. Miller rarely smiled, but his posture was relaxed. He took a drag of his cigarette and exhaled a plume of smoke into the frosty air. As Alara looked at him, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a salute. It was an acknowledgement. Alara nodded back. She turned her face toward the gate and the apple orchards beyond. The war was over. The treaties were being signed in marble halls in Paris and Berlin, but for Alara, peace hadn't arrived with a signature. It had arrived in a cardboard box, measured in inches in width. She marched forward, her boots leaving deep, steady prints in the fresh snow. She was walking to work, but in her heart, she knew she was practicing for the long walk home. And for the first time, she knew she would make it